Good afternoon. Welcome. Today is June 8th, 2026, and this is the June call for the CCL Electrification Action Team. Today we will have a presentation, the second in our series on affordability of the electric grid. And Ray Welch, one of our steering committee members, is going to lead us through a discussion around through a discussion around the electric grid and
rates in particular.
rates. Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry for that. Anyway, with that, Ray, go ahead.
sure. Hi everyone. Let me just bring up a slideshow here, but first let me just tell you a little bit about myself, so you have some context. I worked for PG&E, Southern Gas and Electric, for quite a number of years, and a fair number of those years were involved with rate cases, and so I had a fair amount of exposure to these concepts, and I'm happy to find an opportunity to share them with you. It's not something that I get asked to do very often in my civilian life, so this is kind of fun. Okay, let me find the presentation. Can you all see that now?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so this, as Pete said, this is part two of a three-part series. And I'm going to concentrate on telling you about some efforts that we've undertaken in California, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But first, I wanted to tell you about the organization that I belong to that is driving a lot of these efforts. It's called Climate Future California. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan volunteer group that advocates for equitable, sustainable, and cost-effective climate solutions in California. We're really a spin-off of CCL. And so our broad policy areas parallel those of CCL: carbon pricing and cashback, building electrification, which is sort of the focus of this talk today, clean energy permitting reform, and healthy forests. They all align with CCL policy areas. And the reason for that is that when the Trump administration came into power the second time around, and federal efforts were obviously going to be stymied, a lot of us in California tried to figure out a way to engage at the state level, because California is a very much a leading state on climate change issues. It's just to kind of keep ourselves involved and keep the momentum going and try to come up with ideas that might be transmittable to other states or ultimately the federal level. But CCL asked us not to use their imprimatur, to not do it under the Citizens Climate Lobby logo. And so we had to, because they were concerned that California, being a very progressive blue state, any kinds of activities that might come out of our group might be seen at the national level as competing with the current administration and possibly even somewhat antagonistic towards it. So we scrambled around and came up with this different name, and we've been going forward with that ever since and having some success, which I'm happy to tell you about. So in 2026, we're focusing on some specific policy areas within the electrification framework. We're looking, for any opportunity to support market-based programs to put systemic cost responsibility on polluters like in California, it's called cap and invest. It used to be called cap and trade. We're looking at electric rate affordability to encourage clean electrification of homes and transportation with special attention to reducing volumetric rates. And that's going to be a focus of what I talk about today. And also we're looking at permit reform to speed the installation of clean energy resources and clean energy sources and technologies. And in 2024 and 25, we had some lobbying successes. We lobbied for Prop 4, which was a climate bond, which had a lot of features to it, various programs that pertain to improving climate. And that passed. Senate Bill 1006, grid technology, one of its main features was to require the investor-owned utilities here in California to look at reconductoring and transmission planning improvements, hopefully favoring less expensive approaches than what the IOUs have been typically engaging in, which is, undergrounding has been their big thing. And there are other ways to skin that safety cat with much less money. And so that passed. That was gratifying. And then AB 1207 Assembly Bill to renew the cap and trade program which was relabeled cap and invest by this bill, and it extended the carbon emissions trading program, and it also, in light of something I alluded to in the prior slide about volumetric rates, it moved the climate credits to the 4 highest cost months, which are typically air conditioning months here in California, where rates get expensive. And it also is going to phase gas climate credits over to the electric side. I'll take just a second to explain how that works. Under cap and invest in California, polluters of a certain magnitude have to buy allowances for the right to emit those pollutants, specifically CO2. And that revenue is used in several ways. One of which is to go back to the utility customers to help them offset the cost of those very same rates, which are applied to the polluters. But of course, the polluters try to pass that on. So it's not dissimilar from carbon fee and dividend in that respect. So it used to be they were only issued twice a year, once in the fall and once in the spring. I think one for the electric side of the house and one for the natural gas side of the house, because the natural gas side, also has to, people who engage in natural gas distribution and things like that have to pay these rates as well. These have to buy these allowances. And so now with that AB 1207 focused those rebates in the high cost months to help people reduce their exposure to the bills. And it's a first shot in a long battle, I think, to keep rates and electric costs in general under control. A little more stage setting before we get into the meat of the presentation. Across the United States, there's 3 basic approaches to how rates are set for the commodity end of things. So some states feature competition in the electric commodity market, chiefly at the wholesale level, but sometimes at the retail level. And this is a system whereby the cost of power is unbundled from the cost of the grid. So you have the cost of the electrons are sold separately, bought and sold separately from cost of the wires and the transmission and distribution of those electrons. So this map kind of outlines in very broad strokes where this is true. The gray states are regulated, and this is the traditional utility model where the utility is vertically integrated from the customer's point of view, and you just get all your services from the utility. You don't even draw the distinction between uh, getting your power and the transport system that gets the power to you. But in deregulated states, of which there are two varieties here, you can see from the different colors, the orange states, uh, uh, in the orange states, customers choose between competing energy suppliers while the utility still operates the grid to deliver the power. And in some states, the green states, are kind of mixed models on that. These orange states tend to have a very well-developed and aggressive sort of retail program, whereas the green states have a more limited retail program. We'll talk about that a little bit more. In Texas, I think it's pretty much the entire state. If you are an electric customer, you have to find a third party provider. I don't think there is a default, at least not a statewide default. There might be on a utility area by utility area default, but many people in Texas are having to choose their provider. In California, it's much more limited. There aren't third party providers, an assortment of third party providers that retail household customers can choose from. Uh, they but they do allow for joint power authorities to aggregate load in certain geographic areas, and these are called community choice aggregators. So you get kind of a patchwork of various CCAs across the state selling, buying wholesale, buying power wholesale, and then selling it retail to customers. At the very large customer level, in industrial type of customers, they can buy their power directly from third party providers, and most of them do. And then you have New York, Florida, Pennsylvania also having a various mix of these types of choices. So in a deregulated situation, which California is in, um, the questions are who controls the generation, and in California it's mixed, and there are heavy renewable mandates passed by the legislature that the utilities and the customers all have to observe. In Texas, there's very robust competitive generation. Florida retains the utility retains the ownership of its own plants. So there's a lot of different ways to play this game at the state level. Another important piece of this puzzle is who sets the commodity prices. In regulated states, it's public utility commissions. That's the traditional way to do it. In deregulated states, the commodity prices are set in the marketplace. And in California, that marketplace is pretty complex. And it's one of the reasons why there's not a lot of retail participation, because one of the unique properties of electricity is that it's instantaneous, right? The generation and the consumption have to balance in real time. So nobody, who's going to turn on their light switch wants to have to think about that. So that's all done on their behalf at the CCA level, or if they've elected not to do a CCA, the utility will still buy the power for those people who prefer not to engage with CCAs. I'll just say as an aside, CCAs were formed here in Marin County where I live. The first one was formed. And the impetus was to inspire or incentivize the IOUs, the investor-owned utility, PG&E, the big one here, to be more aggressive about bringing renewable energy sources online and offering people. And I would say that it's done an excellent job of that. Our renewable usage in California has really, really ramped up in the 10 or 15 years that the CCAs have been active. Then who bears the market risk? Well, by market risk means that if you buy the commodity and the market price changes, who takes that loss, or if there's or gain, as the case may be. So one of the things I think that's commonly not understood about uh, electric commodity markets, like the natural and the natural gas commodity market at the utility level, is that they trade at the wholesale level, kind of like stocks. The prices are very volatile. They change by the minute or really by the second. And people decide to jump in here or there and try to make money on the volatility or try to protect themselves from the volatility, depending on what they're doing. My experience was mostly on the natural gas side. And one of my jobs was to protect the utility from price volatility. So you end up engaging in with a lot of banks and a lot of other third-party providers of financial derivatives, so you can hedge, and so that's what a lot of this market risk is about. So the CCAs are having to do that here in California. They're trying to keep their rates just below the rates set by the incumbent utilities. And so they have to do a lot of financial trading in the background to make that happen. So today's focus is California, and some of the concepts I'll discuss here apply to any jurisdiction, specifically how rates are designed, but some will be specific to California's investor-owned utilities. Now, excuse me. California issues and approaches may be applicable to other investor-owned utilities that are governed by utility commissions, particularly in states where the commodity, the supply, has been unbundled from the delivery, the physical grid, and can be provided by third parties. So I'm hoping there's some universality you'll pick up out of this presentation, even if you're not in California. One last piece of stage setting. The reason why we in Climate Future California are so focused on this issue is that our rates are the second highest in the country. And between our desire, as CCL people, to encourage whatever we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the state of California prides itself on being a leader in green energy and renewables, and having rates this much higher than the average is a significant issue for them. So high rates are a disincentive to electrification, and reducing them encourages. So let's take a real big step back and say, what are rates? Rates are the mechanism by which a utility's annual revenue requirement is collected from customers. That the revenue requirement means how much money does it cost us to operate in a given year. So the revenue requirement, all the money that we have to make the system work, is divided by the forecasted load. How much electricity does the IOU, and with the concurrence of the regulators, think that we're going to use in a given year? And you divide one by the other, and that gets you a rate per kilowatt. That, of course, is highly, highly simplified, but that's the essence of it. Note that formula is volumetric, and it's based on a forecasted load. Those are two very important concepts to understand where the leverage points are for reform that will encourage rate reduction and electrification. And we'll get into that as we go along. Another thing to keep in mind is that rates are set prospectively in rate cases every 3 or 4 years. So that means you're projecting a load, you're projecting prices. So there's a couple of big variables in there. You're trying to predict the future here, and then you're doing the math that I showed you above to get the rates, the resultant rates, and that will drive, uh, in part, how much electricity people are going to use, because there's a feedback loop there. The more expensive the electricity, the more conservation it tends to induce. Conservation, just as an aside, used to be the holy grail, used to be the thing that they were focused on. And in a world where you're trying to encourage electrification, that's kind of turned on its head. Conservation, per se, is not necessarily a good thing. You want people to use more electricity. You want them to use it effectively and efficiently, and you want it to be generated efficiently so that it costs less, but you don't want them to use less necessarily in and of itself. So once you've got this basic large calculation, then you've got to break it down further. There are three basic rate classes, and this is all for purposes of cost causation and equity, right? You want to assign the costs to the people who are causing these costs to occur. So there's three broad categories: residential, commercial, and industrial. There's a few other subcategories. There's an agricultural category. They have their own set of rates. But for our purposes, and for the purposes of simplicity, just thinking of residential, commercial, and industrial suits us for this discussion. So a certain amount of the revenue requirement is ascribed to each of these categories, and rates are thus calculated. But within those uh, three broad categories, within each class, there are schedules that correspond to typical end use and load shapes. Excuse me. So, for example, there's one set of rates for small commercial versus large commercial customers. There are time of use rates and there are flat rates, which are generally at the election of the customer. So all these rates have to be calculated and reintegrated so that they add up to the revenue requirement over the projected loads for each of these classes of customers. And within those classes of customers, there's further delineation of tiered rates for equity and conservation purposes. There's a baseline that people are allowed, and in California, that baseline is geography dependent. If you live on the coast, it's going to be lower than what you get if you live inland, where it's a lot hotter and a lot more electric demand driven by air conditioning. Air conditioning, as you all know, consumes a lot of electricity. It's, an air conditioner is a big energy hog. Then, as you go along, because these things are projections, they're forecasts, there's an annual cycle of true up to adjust the actual costs to the forecasts. You have to balance these things. The differences are rolled forward into the following year for rate case period, depending on the nature of the true up. And some inter-year balancing may also occur for extraordinary events. For example, that's happened with the utilities in California due to the wildfires. There have been several applications for intra-year balancing because the costs just got so extraordinary. Or maybe the biggest example was back in 2000 when California embarked on this grand experiment of a rate redesign to encourage retail and wholesale competition commodity level. And it turned out to be a very badly designed system. And the Enrons of the world were able to game it and raise wholesale prices to be 2 orders of magnitude above what the rates were recovering. So PG&E and the other utilities in California applied for some intra-year balancing and intra-year rate redesign, which was denied, which of course just fed the problem, and then PG&E ended up going bankrupt. Something that we have been lobbying for strongly Climate Future California, and it was put into place not because we had anything to do with it necessarily. It was a discussion that was going on even as our little organization was formed, was to take some of the revenue requirement out of volumetric rates and put them into a fixed.
Is the rate frozen for everybody?
Yes,
Yes.
I'll shoot him a text.
In the meantime, someone want to share next steps or where the recording's going to be or?
Yes, just a minute, Lisa. Okay. All right, so we'll drop a link in the chat for recording locations, but our standard locations in the CCL community forum for the electrification team. Ray is aware, looks like he has dropped off of the Zoom and will be logging back in. So yeah, we'll post the links in the CCL community forum and on our YouTube channel. Ray's computer crashed. Hopefully we'll be back up soon. The Murphy's Law is with us as always. So while we wait for Ray, any questions or comments on what he's covered so far?
Sir. Okay, so it looks like firmware's updated. Can I have you plug in real quick?
Yeah.
All right.
Bob, your audio's a little weak if you're asking us a question. Maybe that was background. Okay, so one other note, in the invitation, we alleged that we were going to have an intervener join us to help provide some firsthand personal experience on how that works in working with public utility commissions in rate cases and other regulatory proceedings. But we were not able to get that set up. We had some scheduling snafus with the folks we were trying to work that out with. So we might try that again in webinar 3, or we may just stay focused in that one on the future of the grid. Okay, I see we have Ray back.
Hi, all. I'm sorry about that. Computer crashed. I don't know quite why. We'll try this again. And I'm taking a lot of time, so I'll try to.
Yep. Well, the why is because Murphy's Law. We already figured that out while you were
Try
gone.
to speed things up.
But yeah, so let's see. I probably need to reassign you co-host.
I think you do.
Okay. You should
We're
be
good.
able to get started now. Go ahead.
Great. I can see that. Yep. Let me get this presentation back on the screen. Okay, I think we're back in business. Do you see it now?
Yes,
Yeah, yep,
Okay, you can hear me?
yep.
Okay, so anyway, the idea is to get the some of the revenue requirement out of the volumetric rate components, because that's the marginal cost that people look at for operating these appliances. We want the price of operating fossil fuel based appliances like gas heaters and gas water heaters to be more than it costs to operate their electric counterparts at the margin. And by at the margin, I mean, every time you go to turn it on, you're thinking, okay, how much extra is this going to cost me to operate this? So, so there are many costs within a utilities cost structure that are going to recur on an annual basis, no matter what people do in terms of using the commodity. So our idea, and we're not alone in this idea, is to put more of those costs on a fixed rate. It creates rate stability, and it makes the marginal cost of volumetric rates lower. So the CPUC, the California Public Utilities Commission, did that a couple of years ago, and it just went into effect last year. So broadly speaking, rates capture the utility's capital and expense costs. Capital comprises the utility's rate base. This is steel in the ground. These assets are depreciated over 30 to 50 years, meaning the capital investment is spread out over that time frame. So each year gets its own little piece of that. So you're not, if they build a power plant or string a transmission line, you don't have to pay for it that very year. It's paid over time. It's amortized in a way. And importantly, that capital in the current model, which is pretty common to IOUs all across the country, earns a rate of return each year like a bond. So if I have a certain amount of money invested in capital assets, then that investment is going to be ascribed a rate of return. And in California, I think it's 10% or slightly lower than that right now. It's been as high as 11%, and in some states it's even higher than that. But that's the idea, and this comes from the old days when the basic idea from a social standpoint was to get the utility to build out the electric system as fast as possible and connect as many people as fast as possible. So this was the inspiration. Expenses aren't in rate base, so they don't earn a return. They're passed through a cost, or what is agreed to be cost, which is, those aren't necessarily the same thing. That's kind of what a rate case is for, one of the things it's for. So it's operation and maintenance, salaries, supplies, admin, taxes, extraordinary events like wildfire response. One exception is labor. It is capitalized if it's expended to create a capital asset. And expenses are all subject to reasonableness reviews. And that's a rate case related process where the way the utility spent their money is judged by the utility commission and examined by interveners to make sure that it was spent responsibly and appropriately. Okay, so in California here, electric rates have four basic parts: the fixed rate, which we were talking about earlier, the delivery rate, which is the distribution and transmission costs, those are in rate base, the commodity or generation rate, which is an expense, and generally it's not in rate bases. The commodity purchases aren't, certainly. However, the exception would be legacy generation assets like hydro and Diablo Canyon. Components of those facilities are in rate base. So you can see how complicated this is getting. With consumer choice, community choice aggregators, the commodity and generation costs are notionally passed on at cost, although in reality, these CCAs are setting their rates in reference to utility commodity rates, and they're trying to make a margin to build up their credit rating and build up reserves to help them handle the volatility in commodity prices as they occur. So that's a distinction between the IOUs, where they truly are being held to costs, but in the CCAs they're simply trying to beat the IOUs costs, and they're not necessarily trying to recover their own costs in real time, although that gets to be very complicated for them to manage. And finally, there are non-bypassable charges, certain legacy costs here in California, the old QR contracts, which were for green generation back in the 80s when it was very, very expensive, things like that, nuclear decommissioning and the wildfire fund. Everybody has to pay that. Nobody gets away from that. Those kinds of costs are eligible to put into the utilities rates. So a couple of philosophical concepts I want to make sure everybody gets, because it's important to how rates are calculated. The grid is a shared community-like resource. It's one gigantic machine that must be operated as a unit in real time. It's a natural monopoly like roads. The reason why is because it avoids duplicative investment by society. And because it's a monopoly, it's heavily regulated. And that's where you get into the reasonableness reviews. Another important philosophical concept is rates allocate the revenue requirement, the cost pie, among all customers. And that's another purpose of the rate case, is to make sure that's done in an equitable and reasonable manner. It's a zero-sum game. Reduce one rate, another rate goes up. Reduce the revenue requirement, though, and all rates go down. So the revenue requirement is a good target for lobbying activity. And cost causation we've talked about earlier. You want to make sure who's driving the cost is who's being ascribed the cost responsibility. And so that's going to be more and more important perhaps for my lobbying purposes and yours, is who's driving that cost in these data centers. That's going to be a big source of controversy, because the last thing we need is for somebody to promise to build a data center, have rates go up because of that, because the utility wants to accommodate this big business that's going to bring a lot of revenue onto their system, a lot of tax dollars into the state, and then the data center just decides, oh, I guess we're going over to Texas instead because they offered us a better deal. Meanwhile, we're burdened everybody with all these costs and anticipation. Remember, these are all forecast costs and rates. So revenue collection through rates involves a lot of interlocking dynamic accounting that depends on balancing in future years, due largely to departures from actual load from the forecast. Recovering that revenue requirement depends on reasonableness reviews by the regulators. It's not like the utilities just get to charge whatever they want. It's a very, very long, public, quasi-legal process to get those rates in place. Rates are stable when cash flow matches the forecast. They're volatile when they don't. Black swan events like heat waves, wildfires, earthquakes, unanticipated market design failures can cause revenue shortfalls. And that affects earnings, the stock price, and borrowing costs, or even the ability to borrow, like a PG&E went back twice now. So that risk drives utilities' rate of return. And that's often a target for people who want to reduce rates. It's like the utilities are making too much money, 10% is too much. The fact that they can go bankrupt that crashes their stock price, that eliminates the dividend, that spooks investors. That's the dynamic, the circular dynamic that drives a number like 10% rate of return. So I'm kind of running long here. We could stop here and look for questions, I suppose. I did not think I would go this long. I apologize for that.
Let's take a pulse of the Zoom room. Would folks like to jump into Q&A on what Ray has covered so far, or keep going for a few more slides?
Could do both. Take some questions and then keep going.
Yes, and.
Yes, and we'll improvise.
I have a question to get it going.
Sure.
Maybe you could explain, Ray, how you avoid regressive impact or regressive rates when you put more in fixed charges. I mean, you could easily see people at the lower end of kind of electricity consumption getting stuck with more costs.
Right. Well, one of the things that he did was to look at average bills. How much do people pay no matter what? And that was a big factor in pegging the appropriate amount, which turned out to be in California $24.15. That's the number they settled on. A lot of people think that could be higher and still not have the regressive impact that Michael is describing. But at some point, regressivity kicks in. If the average bill, setting aside the commodity piece, just the transmission and distribution, the delivery cost piece is say $40 a month. You want to make sure you leave some headroom between that number and your fixed rate so that people aren't unduly impacted on the lower end of the economic spectrum.
Right.
Looks like Sandy has a question or a comment.
Yeah, to put this in the chat also, I've always been wondering, has anybody tried allocating the capital costs and the more or less fixed cost based on peak draw for each user? It would seem like, particularly for the grid build out and maintenance, it's driven by each user's peak cost. And the analogy I keep hearing is the church isn't designed for the average Sunday load. It's designed for the amount of people who show up on Easter Sunday. So the impression I always had is the grid is basically driven by the peak loads, and
that's exactly right.
Based per kilowatt hour doesn't really recognize that. Anyway, go ahead.
No, it does actually. The rate calculations do take that into consideration, and that's one of the reasons why the rates are tiered, because the further up the tier you go, that's a volumetric. It's a volumetric staging. So the more electricity you use, the higher the rate gets, because you're presumed to be causing more costs for the system. In other words, the peak capacity is being built for you because you're the one that's going to be using it. So that's why they're designed that way. And that's a concept that's really hard for people to grasp, that it's a peak system, and you can't do it. You can't size the system for average usage, because the peaks happen too frequently, and you would have brownouts and blackouts if it were designed for an average.
Okay, I'd forgotten about the tiers, but that's a pretty blunt tool. You have like 2 or 3 tier, at least in the residential, you've got 2 or 3 tiers.
Right, but you recall from the earlier discussion, you've also got a lot of different customer categories. So industrial customers are going to be paying much more, and commercial customers are going to be paying more than residential customers, because they tend to drive bigger peaks, right? Although they will argue, and some of them justifiably so, that hey, my load is flat, it's high, but it's flat. So don't stick me with these peak costs. So that's that. Now you're getting into the nitty gritty of what happens in a rate case and why it's so hard for the outside observer, like us, people with a civic interest in how this is working, to put forward an argument for the specific rate shape or specific cost composition of a rate. That's what interveners are there for. That's what they do professionally. They get paid to do that, and they get into the nitty gritty of the detail. So let me go ahead here a little bit and talk about that. So the process of rate making is a quasi-legal process conducted by the Public Utility Commission on a 3 to 4 year cycle. There are public hearings, there are lawyers. I mean, there are lots of lawyers. And discovery, it's just like court, except it has fewer of the trappings, but it is very much a legal process. It's based on evidence and the details and the empirical numbers. So that's very hard to drop into casually. So a strategy issue for lobbying is, how best for us, that's Climate Future California, and other state level CCL organizations to influence the rate making process. Well, lobbying legislators is really a conceptual sentiment driven thing. It's like, we think rates are too high, and we think the utility company is, overbuilding. It's fireproofing or choosing the most expensive methods to fireproof itself. We think there are more economic ways to do this. That's about as far as we can take it, and from a public standpoint, unless we are willing to become an intervener and get down into the details, because then you're going to be in a technical, evidence-driven environment where your numbers, whatever you come up with, if you try to counter the utility, are going to be subject to their cross-examination. There is cross-examination in these things, and it's very, very difficult if you don't have the resources to study their numbers in the first place and be very, very conversant with the particulars of what it is that's going on in your state, your state's utilities. So policy tends to be initiated in the political arena. Hey, the people want this, they want lower rates. They suspect that the utilities are not being efficient. And it's not too hard to come up with examples of that without drilling down too much into their detail. For example, undergrounding everything. There's other ways to skin that cat, right? I mean, you can reconductor with more fire resistant materials, and that's a whole lot cheaper than undergrounding. So that's the level I think we'd be most effective at lobbying, is making sure that we are in touch enough with the issues so that we can talk to our legislators about what is feasible for the utilities to do, or what they should be required to study, because a lot of times the first step is to get the utility to cough up the data to the intervener community that allows these things to be analyzed. It allows these like assertions or suspicions to be vetted. Any other questions? Pushback? Other points of
Hey,
view?
Ray, this is Jay, and I just want to make the point, I put it in the chat, that each state is a little bit different on how they do these things and how they manage through their Public Service Commission and the IOUs. And, what would seem to make sense in a rate structure in California may not in Georgia because it's a little bit different. So I just want to make that note.
All right. Sandy?
Yeah, I just want to kind of play devil's advocate for a second, because I think one of the big arguments we're going to hear is California has a huge amount of renewables, and yet we have the second highest electric rates. And the argument has always been renewables have the lowest generation rate. So I just want to have the information to be able to say, yeah, we have a low generation rate, but we have all these other charges, and we have the wildfire charges and that type of thing. Is that consistent? Is that what's driving our charges?
That's part of it. Let me go back to a couple of slides here I had about that.
Okay.
So
I mean, on that slide, how does our generation rate compare with the rest of the country?
I don't have that data at hand, but
Okay.
in California, it's 43% of the total rate.
Mhm.
And that part of it we really can't affect because the market is driving that. Why does electricity cost, on a wholesale basis, X dollars a kilowatt today? Who knows? It's supply and demand. It's a wholesale thing. We don't really have access to that
So some of
in
some of
real
that,
time.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
So some of that may be driven by the cost of even the natural gas that we still have in the system. And I keep hearing that basically natural gas is the one that sets the rate, right?
Yes, yes,
In an
yes,
auction. Okay.
contrary to popular belief, natural gas is exceedingly cheap, and that's a big problem for electrification because because when I'm using my not that I'm just hypothetical me, I do have electric appliances now, but when I was using my um, gas water heater, it doesn't cost hardly anything to operate that thing. It's gas is just really, really cheap. And California is one of the most expensive places for gas in the country. So if you're in Texas or Louisiana, it's next to nothing. It's really, really cheap.
Hey, I'd like to jump in and push back on that a little bit. You phrased that, Ray, as your personal experience, but that's not what studies are showing. And the Lazard accountancy, and I know that is criticized some, but the they do an annual survey and have been doing for over a decade of the prices of electricity, especially focused on generation. And in the last couple of years, solar and wind, the cost of generation have dropped below the cost of just operating coal plants, and they're below the cost of building and operating gas plants. So I I think that's important.
Can I weigh in on that too,
Yeah.
Sandy? Having worked for a solar developer, utility scale, prices have been costs of installing solar have been falling for, over a decade, well over a decade. And yet the utilities in trying to meet their renewable portfolio standards, they executed contracts all along the way. So it may be that some of those were executed at prices higher than what you could get in the market today, signing a power purchase agreement.
So it's just
That's a
a
good
lag
point.
in the system.
Say again?
It's a lag in the system.
Yeah, a big lag in the system because they started needing to meet those requirements years ago when the climate laws were first passed, and have been buying it at increasingly lower prices as time's gone on. But there's still some of those old contracts. They're 20-year contracts or more.
Yeah. There are a lot of legacy costs. If you recall earlier in the discussion, we were talking about forecasts, and facilities are built based on the forecasts. And so you've got to carry those costs forward until they're paid off. And during the crisis of 2000, I mean, some contracts were signed that were pretty outrageous, and some of them were 20 and 30 years, and so we're finally reaching the tail end of those things, but that those costs persist over time. And responding to Pete's point, and also to Michael's point to a degree, yes, the cost of renewables has come down dramatically, and building a solar plant, utility scale solar plant is way cheaper than it used to be. And of course, once you have it in place, there's no fuel costs at all. So that's always improving, but there's still, we're still playing catch up in terms of solving the intermittency problem. So when you build solar, it just doesn't operate 24/7. And as we talked about earlier, you have to build the system to operate at peak, and it's one unified big machine, of which solar are little tiny components. So none of the other costs change really. And solar's contributions, they may be operating at 20% or 30% capacity. Something has to fill in the gaps. And they also, that's where batteries come in. I mean, batteries hold a lot of promise to shift load to take advantage of the slack capacity that is out there in enormous quantities in non-peak times, right? So if if you're building a system to operate for 20 minutes in the middle of the day, or 60 minutes or 90 minutes, around dinner time, you've got the rest of the day where you've got plenty of capacity. So if you can shift some of those loads around with batteries, uh, that could be a very cost-effective way to approach this problem.
Yeah, and that's actually happening very rapidly in real time, especially in California and Texas. Both of those states in the last 4 years approximately have built between 15 and 18 gigawatts of battery capacity, and it is absolutely working to both improve grid reliability and to time shift the energy created by renewables. And with the prices of batteries already low and continuing to drop, that the the near future with storage looks very, very promising.
So I can see that we've gone past 5 o'clock here. I do have a couple more things I could share, but I don't know how people feel about going further.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy to stay and keep the recording going. If folks have to drop, feel free, and we'll have the recording and the transcript so that you can catch up later if you need to.
Okay, I wanted to circle back to Sandy's point about wildfires. So first, I'd like to make a preliminary point that distribution, as you can see on this chart that I've got up there right now, is only about 40% of the total rate. And that's really the only part that we can affect as lobbyists. There's nothing we can really do about generation per se. We can certainly lobby for more renewables and more batteries and things like that. That will definitely help. But in the more immediate term, there's nothing we can do about rates per se that involve generation costs. That's just the market, and the market is going to do what it's going to do. And there's not a lot you can do from the outside about that. But distribution, that's where we can really affect some things, where we can see cost inefficiencies and on a conceptual basis, and suggest ways to drive them down, or work with the intervener community to come up with analyses to support bills that are intended to drive them down, or shift costs out of variable rates into fixed rates. So one of the targets we see, of course, is this is just to show you the distribution is growing here. The other ones are shrinking. Wildfire costs as a percentage of rates is kind of an amazing thing. It's 20% of 20, and for PG&E, it's 27% of the entire revenue requirement. That is an astonishing number. That is a fat, juicy target. And so we've been pretty focused on that on Future California. Because if it's 27% of total revenue requirement, it means there are about 47% of volumetric non-commodity charges, right? I mean, of the distribution rate, it's about 40%, 47%. That's a staggering number. So getting wildfire costs out of volumetric delivery charges is a big deal. Last year, Senate Bill 254 excluded $6 billion of fire risk mitigation capital from rate base for all utilities in California. And they're being financed with state bonds. It's a start, but there's billions and billions more. 30, 40, 50 billion. It's just a staggering number of wildfire costs that are coming down the pike here. So while that's the good news part, there's a fat target. The bad news part is there were two bills, the SB 905, which would establish the Power Program Fund, which would have been a separate fund for among other things, wildfire expenses. And the Utilities Public Purpose Programs Fund, similarly situated to the Power Program Fund, would have devoted some money to wildfire control, would have put it either in the general fund for the state, subject to taxes, which are clearly progressive, right? So that's not a regressivity problem, it's a regressivity solution. Or using the greenhouse gas reduction fund, which is where the cap and invest money goes to, taking money away from programs that aren't doing particularly a good job of reducing greenhouse gases because they're very, very expensive, like high-speed rail, for example. Very expensive program, not doing anything so far and won't for 20 years in the best case scenario to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So these programs are going to shift some money from the cap and invest program to rate reduction and use and export some of the wildfire costs back out to the state budget where they ordinarily would have belonged in years where maybe it wasn't such a crisis and weren't competing proposals to use that state money. I mean, the state budget is constrained, so you have to compete with these other priorities, which in a normal environment is what you want. You want all the priorities on the table so you can have a rational discussion about where to spend the money. But politics are politics. Whoops. And SB 905 and AB 2508 didn't survive the Appropriations Committee review for precisely the reason that they had to do with wildfire, because those costs are too high and too volatile. And the politics around that were, hey, CAL FIRE can't even get funded out of the California budget for its normal business. How are we going to fund in the California budget all these wildfires on top of that? So there was extreme reluctance politically to take on wildfire costs outside of the current utility constructs. So that is going to be an ongoing challenge for us all. And that pretty much wraps it up.
All right. Thank you very much, Ray. And
I'm sorry that took so long. I'm just a little bit embarrassed how long that took.
That's okay. Well, a couple of minutes in the middle was your computer's Murphy's Law.
Not that doesn't make it any less embarrassing. That just kind of compounds it.
No trouble. Anyway, we can. I will go ahead and close the recording now, but we can go ahead and take any more questions that folks have.